Welcome to the lesson number 10 on ecosystems. Let's start off with our definition. We're going to see some definitions that we already have seen, and we're going to get a warm-up practice question on these different definitions here. So, what have we already seen? An individual is one being. A population is multiple individuals. A community is multiple populations of different species. And finally, an ecosystem, what we're examining today, is all communities and the environment in which they exist. Let's see if we can retain that information. We're going to do a pretty easy warm-up practice question on that. Here we go. On the left here, we'll read through these definitions. All communities and the environment in which they exist, multiple individuals, one being, and multiple populations of different species. On the top over here, we need to associate these definitions with individual, population, community, or ecosystem. If this were evaluated, this would be 1 point for each correct association. And what's convenient for us here, and it won't always be this way, but in this question, we have these terms here listed in order from smallest to largest. So individual, we're looking for the smallest. Okay, now's a good time to pause before the answers are revealed. Do attempt the question on your own without referring to the material and without just copying it down from the responses that are given in the video here. All right, if you're unpaused, we're going to move on here. Individual is the smallest. We look for the smallest here. Also the smallest definition, one being. Population would be the next largest one. That's multiple individuals. A community, which one is it going to be? Well, it can't be this one here because this says all communities. So the definition of a community can't include the terms all communities. So this one, community, is going to have to be the only other remaining choice here, multiple populations of different species, which means that an ecosystem, the focus of today, is all communities and the environment in which they exist. Within an ecosystem, we have something called trophic relationships, which are basically energy levels. Specifically, we're talking about chemical energy. So trophic relationships are the feeding connections between organisms in an ecosystem. In other words, the food chain. Trophic level describes an organism's position in the food chain. Here are the trophic levels that we have. We have producer, which is the first one to make chemical energy. And it doesn't create that out of nowhere using magic. It's a transformation of energy, and on this planet, it's going to be coming from sunlight for the most part. There are a few exceptions, but mostly in most food chains, at the bottom of the food chain, we have something that is transforming sunlight energy into chemical energy. So after the producer, we have consumer or consumers, and consumer is basically something that eats something alive. And finally, we have decomposer. Decomposer is something that is going to return decay matter and return it to other simpler chemical forms, inorganic chemical forms. So we're going to go through all of that in detail. Note that consumer, we can have multiple levels here: primary, secondary, tertiary. So there's definitely food chains that have more than 3 organisms in them. So in those cases, we would have multiple levels of consumers. For example, in this one here, so we have an oak tree, which is the producer. It's transforming sunlight energy, solar energy, which is a form of radiant or luminous energy, into chemical energy, sugar. And that is a process called photosynthesis, which at this point we should be very familiar with. So sugar, C6H12O6, and that is being created using energy that is absorbed by the leaves here, and the energy being absorbed is sunlight energy. So this base molecule here of glucose can be connected in long chains, forming carbohydrates and forming cellulose. And so that is then eaten by the primary consumer. In this example, it's a caterpillar. The caterpillar is then eaten by something else. In this case, it's a small bird called a tree creeper, and we call that a secondary consumer because it's not eating the producer, it's eating the thing that's eating the producer. And finally, in this food chain at the top, we have the hawk. We call that tertiary, which is like saying third consumer. So primary, secondary, and tertiary consumers in this food chain with the producer. We don't see any decomposers depicted here, but we're going to examine that in this one over here. So in this diagram, we have another example. We have our source of energy is the sun, and that is absorbed by plants, which use that energy to transform this energy into chemical energy in the form of sugar and cellulose. So this is the first trophic level producer. So this makes the chemical energy. Next up, we have the second trophic level, which is the primary consumers. And so in this case, it's a small rodent. Our third trophic level would be secondary consumers, a snake that's preying on this rodent. And above that, we have some type of bird of prey, which is, again, a tertiary consumer, eating the thing that's eating the thing that's eating the producer over here. All of these produce waste. So leaves fall to the ground, animals urinate and defecate, animals die and their cadavers on the ground. And then what is going to break that down? Decomposers like fungus, bacteria that we see depicted over here. All right, so we've looked at a couple examples and we've looked at our definitions of trophic levels. Now let's do a practice question on this. Here we go. True or false? A primary producer is at the top of the food chain. Now is a good time to pause before the answer is revealed. Okay. This sounds like it would be true because we see top of the food chain and primary. So primary we think of as number one, and top of the food chain we think of as number one. So I can see why somebody would select true, but that's not the case here. It's false. Primary producer is at the bottom of the food chain. It's the first thing that makes chemical energy, which is then consumed by first level, second level, third level consumers, or however many, and then ultimately decomposed. Let's look at a few more details about producers here. Producers are organisms that consume inorganic matter. So they're going to soak up minerals and water and rather than organisms. So they don't eat other living things. A producer gets its energy from typically the sun. Producers are autotrophs. That means that auto means self. Troph is energy. That means they make their own energy. Once again, they don't make it out of nowhere using magic. It's a transformation of sunlight, solar energy. So autotrophs are organisms that generate their own food or chemical energy. We need to define inorganic matter to really understand producers and what they consume, although they're not consumers because they don't eat something living. So inorganic matter is matter that did not necessarily originate in living beings. Living beings can make inorganic matter. So something that would be considered inorganic would be very simple chemicals like ammonium. Ammonium is just a form of chemical nitrogen, and humans produce that, and it leaves us in our urine. That doesn't mean that NH3 is necessarily an organic compound. So we can have inorganic that is made by living things, but not necessarily. So that's the important thing to understand, right? This can be synthesized chemically, doesn't necessarily come from a living creature. So primary producers in terrestrial, so on land ecosystems, are plants. Primary producers in aquatic ecosystems could be plants, but we also have algae and phytoplankton. All right, so as an exploration here, see if you can name some examples of inorganic matter. So as far as the nutrients that we consume, minerals would be inorganic. We have water, which is inorganic. So those are some examples of things that we consume that don't necessarily come from living things. All right, let's do a practice question on this. Which of the following are autotrophs? That means they make their own energy. And we see 3 points, so we're going to want to select 3 that match this over here, autotroph. Is a plant an autotroph? To answer this question, ask yourself, does it make its own energy or does it eat something? And I know there are some examples of plants that eat, but largely plants are autotrophs and they make their own energy. Insects. Insects do not make their own energy. They're going to be eating probably plants or other insects. Phytoplankton, yes, they make their own energy, and algae makes their own energy. Humans, we don't make our own chemical energy that we eat in our body, neither do crustaceans. So the three that are not autotrophs, insects, humans, crustaceans in this example, are animals. All right, so for bonus points here, which of these are terrestrial versus marine? And it's going to be plants are terrestrial and phytoplankton and algae are aquatic or marine. So consumers, we're going to look at a bit more detail on this, and primary, secondary, tertiary. So consumers are heterotrophic. That means we get our energy from different sources, so different energy. Heterotrophic organisms that feed on other organisms. Heterotrophic get food, chemical energy from sources outside themselves. Any organism that eats is heterotrophic. So animals are heterotrophic. Any organism that produces its own food is autotrophic. Primary consumers eat plants, fruits, seeds. So primary consumers eat primary producers. They eat the things that are making the chemical energy. And then above that, a secondary consumer would be eating a primary consumer. So a primary consumer would be, for example, a herbivore that's eating plants, whereas a secondary consumer would be a carnivore and it's eating herbivores. A tertiary consumer would be eating secondary consumers. So this is a carnivore that's probably eating other carnivores. All right, let's do a practice question on this. Now is a good time to pause before the answer is revealed. I'll give you another opportunity to pause after we read through the question here. Select the response that correctly completes the following statement. Herbivores are most likely to be primary producers, primary consumers, secondary consumers, or tertiary consumers. Now's a good time to pause. If you've attempted this on your own and you want to see the response, we are continuing now. So herbivores are most likely to be primary consumers. They're not producers, they're not making their own energy, they're eating, but they're typically eating a producer. Unless we're talking about a carnivorous plant, which is not super common. So plants, let's use a terrestrial example. Plants transform sunlight into chemical energy like sugar, and then a herbivore is going to be eating that. That's the primary consumer here. Finally, let's look at some decomposers, so details on decomposers. Decomposers are organisms that consume the waste and remains of other organisms. So feces, urine, and decomposing cadavers of other organisms. So decomposers break down organic matter originating from living organisms. So typically we're going to have larger, more complex molecules into inorganic substances, so more fundamental chemical building blocks. Examples of decomposers, some worms and insects are decomposers, fungi like mushrooms, and some bacteria. Let's do a practice question on decomposers. It's going to be on the content of this slide. Here we go. Which of the following is not an example of a decomposer? Is it a deciduous tree, bacteria, worms, or mushrooms? Now is a good time to pause before the answer is revealed. And let's go through this. Mushrooms are a fungus. Fungi are decomposers. Some worms are decomposers. And some bacteria are decomposers. So the only remaining choice is deciduous tree. And even if you're not sure, when you read through these four choices, one of them should stand out as the obviously different one from the other three. All right, within an ecosystem, there's something called energy flow that we need to study. So energy flow is the exchange of matter and energy between the different living organisms in an ecosystem and between those organisms and their environment, okay? So we're going to have matter flow from the environment directly to the primary producers, and we're going to have energy flow from the environment to the primary producers. And then that matter and energy, some of it will escape, but we're also going to have a lot of it which is then transferred to the primary consumers and works its way up. Before we continue with a question on this, I'm going to go back to revisit one of our slides here. Notice how in each of these levels we have heat escaping. So in all of these, it isn't a perfect 100% efficiency transfer. There's always going to be energy escaping, and there's always going to be new energy added to the ecosystem in most cases from the sun. All right, so we have energy flow described. Chemical recycling is the process by which decomposers convert organic matter back into inorganic matter. And as an exploration, you can look at the carbon cycle or the nitrogen cycle in an ecosystem. And we've already studied that, but now with this new information from the topic of ecosystems, see if you can go through a diagram of the carbon cycle or the nitrogen cycle and identify as that chemical or molecule is circulating around the planet in different forms and places. What are the items that you can pick out that are decomposers? Which things can you pick out are primary producers, secondary consumers, primary consumers, tertiary consumers, etc., etc. So that's a good exercise. So I encourage you to revisit the lesson that featured biogeochemical cycles of carbon and nitrogen and see if you can now view that with the context of ecosystems and decomposers, tertiary, secondary, primary consumers, and at the bottom of the food chain, the primary producers. All right, let's have a practice question on this. Which of the following is the correct definition of chemical recycling? The process by which decomposers convert organic matter back into inorganic matter. The process by which consumers convert inorganic matter back into organic matter. The process by which consumers convert organic matter back into inorganic matter. Or is it the process by which decomposers convert inorganic matter back into organic matter? So this is not an easy multiple choice question because all four of these sound so similar. But look at the substitutions. We have in this spot over here either the word decomposer or consumer. So what is the definition of chemical recycling? We're going to pick decomposer or consumer, and then we'll have narrowed down our choices into two. And then at the end here, we have organic into inorganic, or we have inorganic into organic. So it's only one of those. That's going to help us narrow it down further to find the correct response. Now is a good time to pause before the answer is revealed. So which of the following is the correct definition of chemical recycling? It is organic into inorganic, which means that we can eliminate this choice here and this one here. And is this done by decomposers or consumers? This is done by decomposers, which means this is our correct response. Energy flow in an ecosystem is not cyclical and not renewable, so we always need to have energy added into an ecosystem, as we discussed before with the escape of heat, but there's always continuously the addition of solar energy into an ecosystem. Energy escapes ecosystems as heat, and new energy must be added to the ecosystem in the form of sunlight. Question, are there any other forms of energy that can act as primary energy sources for ecosystems? Think about that. Maybe pause and unpause when you're ready. I'll reveal that we have autotrophs that don't get their energy from sunlight. They get it from other forms of chemical energy that are inorganic and from heat. So they're getting their matter and energy on probably deep sea thermal vents, where we have heat escaping from the lithosphere into the bottom of the ocean, and we can have some microorganisms that live just on that without eating other things and without having access to sunlight. So that's an example of other forms of energy that can act as primary energy sources. Not super common though, so in this topic, we mostly consider sunlight as the primary energy source for most ecosystems. All right, let's have a question on energy flow. Here we go. What is the primary source of energy for nearly all ecosystems on Earth? Well, we just mentioned it. Pause if you like, unpause. Heat and chemicals could be a minor one. Sugar needs to be made by something organic, something alive. And temperature is just a measure of heat, so we're not going to count that. Sunlight. Sunlight is the primary source of energy for nearly all ecosystems on Earth. And we see that once again in this diagram that we've revisited a couple times. All right, finally we're going to look at biomass. Biomass is the total mass of organic matter, so how much stuff there is in an ecosystem at a given time. Primary productivity of an ecosystem is the amount of new biomass generated by its producers. Factors that can influence that are amount of light, amount of water, amount of nutrients, and temperature. So the thing at the bottom of the food chain, how much is it actually producing? It's going to depend on possibly these 4 factors here. See if we can retain those. We're going to have a question on biomass and primary productivity. And here we go. Which of the following factors influence the primary productivity of an ecosystem? I remember seeing some of these. Now's a good time to pause before we reveal. Temperature, oxygen, time, nutrients, light. And so the terms that we just saw, the factors that we just saw, were light, amount of nutrients, amount of water, I don't see here, and temperature. So those are the 3, temperature, nutrients, light, that we saw on the previous slide here. All right, the final thing that we need to examine with ecosystems are disturbances. So disturbances are events that damage ecosystems. They can be naturally occurring or result from human activities. Disturbances can lead to the elimination of organisms, or they can alter availability of resources. Naturally occurring disturbances could be rainstorms, snowstorms, hurricanes, sandstorms, tornadoes, volcanic eruptions, floods, ice storms, forest fires, etc. Human disturbances could also be forest fires, could be floods, oil spills, mudslides, etc. Human activity resulting in climate change can also cause an increase in the above listed naturally occurring disturbances, but we're going to consider that indirect. So if humans cause a forest fire because they accidentally set the forest on fire, that's pretty direct. But if forest fires are occurring naturally as a result of drought, and the drought is a result of global climate change, sure, that is caused by humans, but not directly, so we'll consider it naturally occurring, although the frequency of which might be affected by humans. So let's have a practice question on this, where we need to categorize these as which of the following disturbances can be directly caused by humans. So forget the ones that can be indirectly caused by humans, just consider directly. Oil spills, these can be directly caused by humans. Volcano eruptions, I don't have the technology to do that. Maybe you do, but I don't consider this something that can be caused by humans. Tornadoes, same thing. Forest fires, that's a really easy example. Of course, humans can cause forest fires. Hurricanes, maybe indirectly, but not in a direct way that can be observed or proven. Floods, let's see here. Yeah, we can cause floods. Rainstorms, sandstorms, snowstorms, ice storms, no. Floods would be caused by, for example, if we are doing a project to transform hydraulic energy into electrical energy, like a dam, where we're blocking a river or waterfall or something like that, that's going to be causing a flood. So that could be caused by humans. Moving on. Ecological succession is what occurs after a disturbance. So after a disturbance, we're going to see the ecosystem restoring itself. So here's a really good example of forest fire. What happens after a forest fire? We have something called pioneer species, which are pushing into the disturbance, into the area that's been disturbed. So grass and weeds, things that grow easily, things that grow quickly are going to be the first to fill in. Once we have that, then we're going to have some low-level growth filling in, mid-level growth, bushes, shrubs, ferns, etc. Finally, when those push in, and those ones are the ones that are quicker to grow, then we're going to have enough shade to protect saplings and seedlings, and then we're going to have some trees filling in from the boundaries, and eventually we'll have new trees. So in this example of a forest fire, this is the ecological succession that follows. Pioneer species, low level, mid-level growth, finally saplings and seedlings, which will grow into large new trees. Okay? We're going to have one final question on this, and that's going to be it for this lesson. Which of the following correctly defines an ecological succession? After disturbance, changes occur to an environment until an equilibrium is removed. After a disturbance, changes occur to an environment until an equilibrium is restored. During a disturbance, changes occur to an environment until an equilibrium is removed. Okay, we could probably answer this even if we have no idea what the definition is, because we have three choices, and of those three, let's pick out a word that's different in each. So, after a disturbance is in two answers, and during a disturbance is only in one. So after disturbance is more probably the answer. And then we just have to narrow it down between these two. Is it an equilibrium being removed or restored? And the answer is an equilibrium is restored. All right, so that concludes our lesson on ecosystems. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one.